You know how I can tell that you're a beginner photographer? Your images are not sharp. You are looking at your pictures and you're wondering, why are all my pictures so damn unfocused? There is no way to go back to Photoshop the sharpness in an image, so making sure your subject is focused, that should be your #1 priority. Also, I will let you know my #1 thing to make sure my subject is in focus and is as sharp as possible. Today, I want to take a look at this video called How to Get Super Sharp Photos Every Time with Any Camera. This video was made by Pat K.
It doesn't matter what device it's on. I'm always thinking about 4 different things. The first 2 of them are settings. So I'm always thinking about shutter speed and focus. And the other 2 things are more like scenario-based things. So I'm thinking about, is the subject moving or is the subject still? And it's these 4 things that when put together, when you consider them and all the rules that go with them, which I'm about to cover in this video, then every single shot that you make, regardless of the camera, will be sharp. Now, at the end of the video, I'll also add in some supplementary things that can either help or hinder your overall sharpness as well. But these 4 things are the foundation to make sure that every single shot you take will end up being sharp. All right, so thinking about the scenarios, is your subject moving or is your subject still? So let's tackle still subjects first. So if you're shooting things like architecture or landscape or still life or anything like that where the subjects, they don't move, then in terms of shutter speed and focus settings, what you'll need on the shutter speed side is something that is 1 to 3 times your focal length. And what I mean by that is, say for example, you're shooting a landscape image and you are shooting with a 16mm lens at the 35mm equivalent, then you want to be shooting at 1/16th of a second, or usually 1/15th of a second in most cameras. Equally so, when you're shooting at, say, 200mm and you're shooting, the landscapes at that focal distance, then you want to be making sure that the multiplier is higher. So in this case, you might want to go up to a 3 times your focal length.
Yeah, this is very technical. For a beginner photographer, this might just go over your head. One thing to keep in mind from my perspective in terms of shutter speed would be exactly like he mentions, is the subject moving? Because obviously your shutter speed is going to dictate the amount of blur that the image might create with the moving subject, right? You're also kind of at the mercy of the environment, right? So the environment is going to dictate a lot of the shutter speed as well. And something that kind of helped me, photograph better was not necessarily shoot in manual. I know a lot of people say that, but having a mode like shooting in aperture priority that kind of takes care of the shutter speed would actually be very beneficial. Not that you couldn't do it in manual, but trying to figure out your shutter speed personally is something that I kind of just eyeball off the screen and also from the histogram as well. So, you gotta take a couple of test shots and kind of see how the movement of the shot either complements or kind of kind of makes the image a little muddy. So you gotta take a look at that.
Multiplier. So if you're shooting at 200mm, you might want to start at 1/600th of a second in terms of your shutter speed. What you want in this kind of shutter speed setting is to make sure that you're combating the camera shake that you're eventually going to end up making. Obviously, if you're on a tripod, then these rules don't really apply to you. But if you're shooting handheld, then 1 to 3 times your focal length is a great place to start. And
yeah, that's the other thing. If you're gonna be shooting anything that is still on the tripod, it's gonna be pretty simple. You're not gonna have any issues. A lot of the time, like he mentioned, is that the shutter speed will kind of rely a lot in terms of like your own movement on how you hold the camera, right? How steady can you get that camera? Obviously, if you don't have like the steadiest hand, you're gonna need a slightly faster shutter speed to compensate for the little shakiness that you're gonna have. Like if you're in a moving car or something like that, right? It's gonna definitely affect the proper shutter speed that you're gonna have. And it can also fall into a stylistic part as well, where depending on the movement that you're trying to capture and how it falls with your style, you're going to be like changing the shutter speed for all that.
When it comes to focus, things are really simple. So I use autofocus single or a single point autofocus mode, or I use manual. So this is great.
Yep, single point. One of the first, as a default, to be honest, I throw my camera and place the focus box literally in the center. Because from there, I can lock it, half click, lock it, move around, and then I know that particular thing is in focus, right? It's kind of like you pick and then you choose, and you pick and then you move around, right? To kind of compose your image. And having a very kind of knowing exactly where your focus is will definitely help you create that very sharp image like off the bat, right? You don't want to like start taking the pictures and not know where your focus area is in the camera, and just having it be kind of a standard thing that you go like, okay, for this particular day, this particular situation, I like to have my focus be in the center. Maybe it's tiny, maybe it's a bigger box, right? Or maybe it's like a multiple places in the scene. So
Great, because your subject or the distance away from your subject isn't going to move, and so you can lock in that focus and that's fine. Happy days. It's very, very simple. Now, when it comes to moving subjects, on the other hand, so when you're doing things like shooting portraits, or you're shooting people, or you're shooting street photography, or you're shooting sport, in terms of shutter speed, what you'll be looking out for is what is the shutter speed that will allow you to freeze the action. And a great place to start for that is 1/400th of a second. There are other things that are modifiers in terms of this number. If the subject, for example, in your frame is quite large, it takes up a large portion of your composition, or if the subject is moving quite fast, then generally you want an even faster shutter speed than that as well. Something like 1/1000 and above.
the rule is the faster the thing is moving, the faster the shutter speed that you should be using to create that still image if that's something that you're going for.
Is ideal. As for an example, in sports, you want to be shooting well over 1/1000th of a second, because people are going to be moving fast, and the subjects, the humans in those frames, are going to be quite large. They're going to take up quite a large portion of the overall frame. And so there's a lot of movement on the camera, there's a lot of movement on the person, and so you need a high enough shutter speed to be able to combat that. So when it comes to focus, what you want to be using is...
So you'll notice that with the faster shutter speed, your image might be a little darker than you might wish, because the shutter speed is going so fast, right? So you're only allowing it to kind of capture the light really quickly. So one thing that you definitely want to make sure you're doing is, when you're looking at that, is your image too dark, right? If using while you're using a fast shutter speed, right? You don't want to. There is going to be a sweet spot in between where, like, okay, the exposure, you're balancing the exposure with the shutter speed, and that's something that you kind of want to be keeping in mind, is creating that balance between the shutter speed and the exposure that you're creating, right? The longer the exposure, the brighter the image is gonna be, right? So let's say you're looking at like some movement, whether it's water in a creek, and you're trying to make it look more flowy, right? You're gonna try to create, okay, let me just open my camera up for an exposure of like 30 seconds to a minute, right? And in a bright day, you might look at that, and the exposure might be crazy. It might be so bright that you might not be able to get that type of movement. So you also want to make sure that you're not just looking at the exposure time, but you're also looking at the exposure and how it looks once the image is created.
Is a continuous autofocus mode. And this allows the camera to select a point and then constantly pull the distance between the lens and that point to make sure that that's constantly in focus. So rather than like a single point autofocus in landscapes, for example, where you're just setting this focus point, and then if the subject or you moves, then suddenly it's out of focus, the continuous autofocus modes constantly pull. So for example, the camera that I'm shooting on right now has a eye tracking continuous autofocus mode right now.
Yeah.
So if you pay attention to my eye and I move forward, that, and I move back, the camera automatically tracks that and makes sure that I'm in focus the entire.
Yeah, understanding when to use this setting is gonna definitely help. Like for right now, like he mentions, like a talking head, your head is moving and the camera is adjusting its focus, so the image can look sharp. You don't always want to have that setting available. If it is maybe someone running around and you definitely want to make sure that that person is in focus, then yes, you would definitely turn that autofocus on and kind of like tap it however your camera does it, and make sure that that camera keeps track of that object, that person, that thing. It'll help you have those sharp images. This kind of depends a lot on your camera as well and how fast it does this. So, not every camera is going to have as fast as tracking as every other camera. So you want to make sure that you understand the limitations of the tracking that the camera that you have has.
Entire motion, regardless of the distance that I am to the camera. And this is really important, especially for things like portraits, where getting the eye in focus is absolutely critical. And that's kind of it. It really is that simple. There's just 4 things to worry about. It is the subject moving or is the subject not moving? And then what are the shutter speed and the focus mode settings that correspond to those things? This is the secret of sharp shots. It's literally, if you get either of those 2 settings wrong for the
90%, 99%,
then
you'll get
there is no way to sharpen back a blurry shot in post-processing, for example.
Nah.
If one of those 2 things doesn't go well, then you're not gonna have an image that is as sharp as it could be. But of course, in addition, there are supplementary things that can either help or hinder you in whether or not your final image will be as sharp as it could be, or might be a little bit softer than actually desired. And the first thing is gear. So lenses are usually where you'll find the most gains to be had when it comes to having sharp images. Much more so than bodies. So the disparity between a really cheap lens and a top of the line lens is not only quite large in price, but also it is quite.
Yeah, this is obviously, there are limitations. You're gonna have limitations in terms of like how can you get your image to look as sharp as X or Y and Z, and the gear is definitely gonna dictate the sharpness. To someone that's looking at a lot of images most of the time, right? To normal people, to common people that aren't a photographer, that might just go over their head. However, for you at this point, you've probably noticed the level of sharpness that different photographers have, that different situations can bring. And yeah, your gear is gonna dictate for sure the quality of the sharpness.
Quite large in sharpness as well. But that kind of difference isn't the same when talking about bodies, for example. The difference between, say, the RX100 Mark VII compact camera that I always use versus the A7R Mark IV main camera that I always use, the difference in sharpness there is not as severe as, say, the difference in sharpness of a kit lens versus the top of the line G Master. That difference in the lens marker is definitely a lot more than in the body version. So the general advice when you're considering sharpness is to pick a mount that you can stick with. So for example, the Sony E-mount that you can stick with for many years, and so that you can start to invest more of your money into lenses rather than bodies. So another thing I want to talk about is aperture and depth of field.
Yeah, bodies you want to buy very rarely, because the lenses are really what makes that picture, what really is able to, you're going to be able to create more really based on the lens, not so much the body.
So you might have heard of lenses with apertures like f1.2 or f1.4 or f1.8. Really shallow depth of field lenses, we call them fast lenses. And these fast lenses are fantastic for generating out of focus areas and really focusing you on the important parts of the frame. But the problem...
Yeah, exactly. They're really sexy. 1.8, 1.5, right? And naturally, those lenses are gonna be more expensive. They're just, trust me, go online and you'll see that anything with a 1 or a 2 is gonna be significantly more expensive than something even at 3, right? So you want to actually make sure that you understand what the aperture does and how you're using that aperture, because that is essentially the window of focus that you'll have to create your image. Just because you like the blurry background look when you take pictures and you know crank it up to like the lowest aperture setting that you have, your window of focus is going to be so narrow that you literally have to be so intentional with that, even for a portrait, that it's going to definitely distort your subject. And really understanding the aperture and how to play with that is going to be key to also creating sharp images.
Problem here is that sometimes the older bodies can have a harder time focusing with lenses that have a very shallow depth of field. You'll see often that sometimes, you know, in portraiture, for example, the shot might be focused on the eyebrow rather than on the eye. And because the depth of field is that shallow, it is that thin, it really is distracting.
You don't want to use a very shallow depth of field for a portrait anyways, unless it's like a stylistic thing and then you're doing some like artsy stuff.
And that is something to call out and to look out for. And in the newer bodies is not so much of a big deal anymore. But generally with focusing with aperture, the higher numbers, so f4 or f8, will give you a much larger depth of field, which gives you a lot more leniency to make sure that the things that you're trying to shoot are in focus.
Like if you're shooting a group of people, not all those individuals are going to be on the same plane, right? One's going to be slightly off, one's head is going to be here, the other one over there. And if you use a very shallow depth of field or a very low aperture, the window of focus is going to be much more narrow. So if this is what your aperture is going to be super narrow, right? And then you have a face here and a face here and a face here. Everything that's not in the center is going to be blurry and out of focus and not sharp. So for a group of people, you want to make sure you're using an aperture that is appropriate for that. And, you know, something like a 5 or a 6 is actually perfect. Just to make sure that everyone in the shot is in focus. It's the worst thing it's really the worst thing ever when you see a picture of a group of people and only like 1 or 2 people are in focus and everyone else just has their face kind of like, and you don't really understand why or where that, you know, how you can change that. Check your aperture, because you're not allowing the camera to create a bigger container for the focus.
Now, the last thing I want to talk about is ISO. And with ISO, what you're looking for in terms of the exposure triangle, so when you're learning photography basics, there's shutter speed, there's aperture, and there's ISO. What you're looking for is to adjust your shutter speed and your aperture to the correct settings depending on your context, depending on your goals, depending on how you want to shoot that particular image. And then use your ISO as the gain. So is the exposure high enough or does it need to come down, right? You use ISO last, typically.
Last thing you want to change. Seriously. If you can adjust your camera and get the perfect image without changing your ISO, that's the way to go.
And with ISO, people are, I guess, afraid of the noise that comes with that. There is this culture of avoiding noise at all costs. But with that, don't be scared of noise. Don't be scared of cranking up your ISO if it means that the shutter speed that you use is absolutely spot on. Because noise can be kind of removed in post-processing, especially in post-processing software in today's world. One thing to consider and one thing to just be on the lookout for is that higher ISOs do generally give off a little bit of a softer look to them, which can be kind of fixed in post-processing, but that is also something to be wary of. But that in and of itself is never going to be as bad as not getting the correct shutter speed up front. as a little.
Yeah, I mean, like I mentioned, the shutter speed, like I mentioned before, it might be, you know, not bright enough, right, with the shutter speed that you're using, which means you have to crank out the ISO. And it's just like that, the moving the ISO is just like that extra step, right, that you have to keep in mind to make sure that you get the image that you want. And for a lot of beginner photographers, that third step of changing the ISO might be one of the last couple things that you kind of start adjusting. But once you kind of, like he mentions, right, there is kind of like this thing where no one wants a little bit of grain, which you can actually, like he mentions, take care of in post-production. But yeah, I think understanding and utilizing ISO might be something that you might be doing at the more intermediate side of photography. Shutter speed and the aperture, those things are going to change your image in terms of how motion is shown, right? And having those two things in mind at the very beginning of your photography journey is crucial, right? Like if you can keep those two things 99% of the time, 95% of the time, you're gonna be fine, right? It's just those very particular moments where you really have to adjust the ISO to get that perfect or that extraordinary shot that you probably couldn't get because of the limitations of the shutter speed or the aperture is, you know, it's gonna come in a little bit later in your journey. And just keep in mind, definitely write down ISO. You know, but don't go crazy with the ISO. Try to fix all your problems with the shutter speed and the aperture.
A little bit of a bonus if you're using Instagram to share your work. There are specific settings that will allow you the best export settings in Adobe Lightroom to export to Instagram, and I have a video all about that right here, or check out the link in the description. All right, that's it. These are the things that I follow every single time with any camera that I'm using to make sure that every single image I take is absolutely tack sharp and crispy every single time. All right, I hope you enjoyed this video. Hit that like button and subscribe and all that good stuff. If you're looking for extra photography content, I do a image analysis on my Patreon where I break down one of my portfolio pieces every single month, and I tell you guys the story, the way that I decided to shoot it, and the settings, how I decided to approach the edit.
That was awesome, Pat K. That was really good. I think he definitely covered pretty much 99% of how to get an image focused and sharp, right, every single time. The video, how to get super sharp photos every time with any camera. If you haven't taken a look at this video, go over there and give it a like. So, what is my #1 tip to make your images look sharp and crispy every single time? And that thing is knowing your camera and the settings that you are in currently before you get out there and shoot. Knowing exactly how your camera is working at the moment is gonna allow you to create the images that you want. Knowing exactly where your focus is before you even pull up your camera, it'll give you a stepping stone in terms of where do I go from now, and you're not trying to figure out where it is or, you know, what am I doing, right? Just being prepared and knowing where the focus area is in your camera as you're taking pictures is gonna be very, very helpful. One great exercise to make sure your images are sharp is to throw your focus in manual. And having that manual movement will allow you to look and be intentional about where your focus is at all time. So if you want to practice, throw your camera in manual focus mode and see what you can come up with. And there's going to be more videos like this one where I talk about photography right there. And I'll see you guys next time.